put your hands on a sort of psychological reason for why in Australia, the United States and other countries, the judges will look maybe with more length and more attention at the exceptions to simple return. So you may have hit upon something there. It's not something you could ever explain in reasons for judgment, because it would border on the side of pop psychology and would not be terribly convincing. But it may still be right, you know. It may be right. Yes.
Thank you for coming today. It's a privilege to meet you, Justice Kirby. I have two things to say. I absolutely agree with Justice Forrest's decision regarding the return of the football girls going back to Italy. I remember around that time it was a media circus, and it was well publicised by the media, it was all over the place. And it was, what I want to talk about really is the 2009 case. The NW, the New Zealand.
Oh, New Zealand.
That is so bizarre. I remember.
I'm glad you're mentioning this.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not re-arguing my dissent. I'm not going to go there and get myself all upset about the fact that other people didn't agree with me. But, you know, whatever view you might have about Mexico, our neighbour, our fellow Anzacs.
And I just. Why did they refuse the return of the child when exactly it's New Zealand? They made a decision. They basically reversed.
It went to the family court of New Zealand. They had it before them, and then suddenly, and there was also some evidence. I think. Well, you'll just have to read the case.
I do remember it being publicised around that time. I think he was holidaying in Australia, and the father of the child, and the father didn't want him to be returned to the mother due to all these reasons.
Yes, there was some evidence, as I remember, that the mother had a drug
habit. She did have a drug problem.
But that's not relevant. The child is still her child. Mm-hmm. But just putting him on a plane and grabbing him and taking him, and from New Zealand, and where it's before the New Zealand courts, that seemed to me to be a classic case where faithful operation of the convention would lead to the child being returned. I can't tell you, and I do not remember. I mean, the judges who sat on that case were all people of the greatest integrity, honesty, talent, professionalism. So they would have felt that that was the right decision to make, and it probably had something to do with one of the exceptions, grave harm to the child. I do remember one case involving Greece where it was said the child was autistic, and that facilities for treating autism in Darwin, which is the place to which the child was abducted, were much better than in Greece. And I can imagine and understand that might lead a judge, especially a high judge, a judge acting on the evidence, to say, well, look, I'm not just an automaton here. I'm not just going to give effect to this convention. I agree, we've got the convention, it's a good thing, and I'll give effect to it in cases where I think it should be given effect, but there are exceptions. I'll weigh the exceptions and I'll look at what the law and the justice of the case requires. And there must have been something. You'll have to have a look at that. And that would be worth actually a discussion. But I just don't have the detailed facts in my mind. But I remember at the time, I love New Zealand. I even once debated the then Prime Minister, Sir Robert Muldoon, on Radio Pacific, which they call Radio Pacific. I debated him about allowing New Zealand to become another state of Australia, as the Imperial Act contemplated. The Imperial Act of our Constitution that gave effect to what the people of Australia had decided said such of the colonies of New South Wales, New Zealand, Victoria, etc., as come together in the Commonwealth. So it was a possibility. Sir Robert wouldn't agree with the state. I then offered him 2 states, North New Zealand and South. And I detected that he was beginning to waver. And I then threw in Stewart Island as a 3rd state. Uninhabited, I think uninhabited, bird-inhabited island down the bottom, but he wouldn't be moved in the end. But leave aside my feelings, it just struck me, especially as the boy was Maori, maybe I had a view that that was a factor which actually the New Zealanders would be better to judge how you would adjust the custody, access, and you know, this is the child. We're talking about a child, and the child's best interests here, which must always be in the background of anything you do relating to children. Anyway, I can't tell you, but you'll just have to read the... But I didn't agree with that at the time. Yes?
Just going onto that, just this issue of New Zealand, do you always fall, or do you always perceive that most of your cases that you want to bring a public awareness into, for example, in child abduction convention, you want these cases to bring an open mind to the public, that we are doing something about it, that the media isn't the only one that's controlling what the information is being presented to Australians, that you want to have a stronger voice as well as a stronger awareness campaign, that conventions, international law is assisting these social issues that we are suffering in a developed nation?
Well, campaign is not a word that I welcome. I mean, the judges don't choose their cases. I didn't have anything to do with choosing that New Zealand case. It just came up to me. I had to appeal book, I had to prepare for it, I had to think about it, and I had to decide it. But you have to be very suspicious of media, particularly in Australia, where there are so few outlets of the general public media, and they sometimes, with celebrity journalists, have a campaign. You know, keep little blogs, dear little Matui. He should be kept in Australia. He'd be better. And I remember when I was a boy, we had the Mace Murray case. It's in the High Court of Australia. Mace against Murray was whether an unmarried mother could keep her child. And one newspaper group supported the unmarried mother, and the other group supported the adoptive parents. It was a really sad case. I mean, both had human dignity and were entitled to respect, and both loved the child. It's actually worth reading, and read it if only to see how our social views have changed since those days. But so you sometimes get campaigns, and they get on the bandwagon, and it ends up in the Women's Weekly, which is the ultimate sign of a celebrity issue. I think because of my decade in the Law Reform Commission as chairman of the Australian Law Reform Commission, at a very critical phase in my intellectual development, for 10 years I did that job, I always saw law in a social context and in an international context, and therefore I saw it as my job to try to explain those features, which not everybody regarded as interesting or relevant. That's their entitlement. I mean, I'm not saying I'm the only voice, but I had my obligation to explain it to myself, and therefore to explain it to others. As it happened, I happened to be a very good writer. I mean, why do law students love me? They love me because, as Chief Justice Mason said, if you want to know what the case is about, you have to start with the Kirby judgment. I'm not telling you what I say, I'm telling you what a very, very great Chief Justice of Australia said, and it is the truth. Do you think it happened because I grew up in Concord? that I didn't grow up in Warunga or in leafy Bellevue Hill. I grew up amongst ordinary folks, and I can explain things in the language of ordinary folks. So I want to do that, and I find it interesting. People say to me, what was the most interesting case you ever sat in? I always answer, it was the last case. Every case was interesting. I found all the cases interesting. My job wasn't going to sleep in court, my job was hyperactive. So I think the answer is I did find these things interesting. I found the context, and I found the international context, which everybody else was ignoring, interesting. And so I had to explain that in giving my reasons. Yes?
Just as a bit of sort of follow on from those questions, how would you reconcile these 17 babies that have been born in Australia to asylum seekers? Just because it's prominent in the media at the moment, there's arguing about whose state they belong to and whether or not they should be granted protection visas and what should happen to them. And the mothers are up in arms, the media's up in arms, everyone's upset about it.
Oh, everyone's up in arms, yes. But
Incorrectly or correctly?
I would study the applicable law, if there is any. I would go back to what I wrote in Minister for Immigration Against